A Ghost Story by Zzarchov Kowolski. Carlos stared down at the body as the rain buffeted him and his cloak danced in the terrible winds. Carlos numbly leaned down and picked up the satchel from the ground, briefly running his hands over the wet grass to ensure it had not spilled any of its precious contents when it fell. He stood and stared across the barren grasslands in the darkness, squinting from the rain in his eyes. With no shelter, he would be dead by morning. His limbs were already sluggish from the cold. Lightning flashed, and in the distance he caught sight of a crumbling ruin, an abandoned watchtower from when this was a lawless frontier. This was no longer the frontier. Carlos felt uneasy at this sudden salvation. A pessimist by nature, he believed that he was cursed with bad luck, and that anything fortuitous was merely a cruel trick by the fates. He reflexively fumbled for the cross about his neck to kiss it before pausing. "I guess you won't help me any more." Carlos let the cross drop limply about his neck as he shot a final glance at the body before pulling his cloak about him and starting towards the ruin. The tower was in terrible shape. He could see a window on the third floor was missing outright, with piles of stones and a broken lintel piled at the base. A brick chimney seemed to still be intact, meaning this tower had doubled as a manor or homestead. Perhaps the hearth is still intact, and I can warm myself. Carlos circled the tower base and found a ramp leading to a weather-beaten door. Fumbling around in the rain for a latch or handle, he felt dozens of gashes from axe blows and a myriad of small gaps in the wood. Frustrated and worried about the cold, he pried free a plank with his bare hands. There was a loud snap as the plank finally gave way beneath his frantic pulling. He shoved his hand into the opening and groped about for a latch for a solid minute before he found it and hauled the door open, nearly stumbling back and falling off the side of the ramp. He was gifted with a great deal of brawn, but even without half-frozen limbs, he had never been described as graceful. Carlos slumped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. With some effort, he was able to close the latch without standing. He then tipped sideways and breathed heavily for a few moments before sitting back upright. It was pitch black, but he both heard and felt the water pouring off of him. He unclasped his cloak and tossed it aside. It hit the ground with a heavy, wet thump. He ran his hands through his thick black hair and flicked water into the darkness. He set down his satchel, traveling pack, and scabbard before removing his drenched shirt and wringing it out. That done, Carlos felt around the floor and noted it was cobblestone. He crawled forward and eventually found dry-ish straw and dirt. Carlos smelled his fingers and confirmed it was actually dry dung. This chamber had been a stable or a barn to shelter livestock from raids. Carlos swept his arms along the floor to gather a small mound of straw and dried dung dust. Leaning back, he rooted through his traveling pack and drew forth a candle and a piece of flint that he placed near the mound of dust and straw. He drew the dagger from his belt and paused before sighing and wiping it on his hand to clean it. He shaved some slivers of wax onto the pile of straw before striking the dagger and flint together until it started a fire a moment or two later. Carlos hurriedly lit the candle in the quickly dying fire and stood up. The dim candlelight revealed a large open area, no doubt the entire ground floor. The ceiling was wooden beams and planks, mostly dry, except near the south wall where the beams bowed and water dripped between planks, no doubt pouring in through the hole where the window was missing. He couldn't make out the far wall, but the presence of wooden stalls told him that this had indeed once been a barn. Peering into the nearest stall, he saw a mound of musty straw. Carlos glanced about nervously and retrieved his satchel, carefully hiding it in the straw. "With the terrible cost I paid for you, you had better be worth it," he muttered as he once more glanced about the room. "There must be stairs to a bedchamber. A bedchamber with a hearth?" he said almost pleadingly. Cradling the flickering candle with his hands for warmth as much as light, he slowly moved deeper into the room. Ahead, the candle began to illuminate shapes that Carlos knew too well from the crossroads. His already chilled blood turned to ice as he approached the two bodies hanging from the beams. They were long dead, a pair of desiccated corpses hanging from brittle nooses. Carlos thought back to the words of his grandmother, warning him not to light a candle in the presence of a body. A low fear crept into the back of his mind, and grew worse when he noticed the writing on the wall behind them. "Wake us." Carlos stumbled back and nearly dropped his candle. He would have fled if not for the storm. He peered into the dark and saw the outlines of stairs near the writing. With a gulp, he moved past the bodies and stepped on the first stair, which let out a loud creak. Carlos stopped and looked back at the bodies. They were unmoving. Carlos drew his dagger and once more began climbing the stairs, each one protesting loudly under the weight of his steps. As he reached the landing to the second level, he gazed about to get a grasp on the layout. Next to the top of the stairs was a ladder leading up. Carlos touched it and felt trace amounts of water. Straining his eyes against the darkness, he thought he could make out a hatch. A falling drop of water confirmed that for him. That led out, or at least to a less sheltered area, Carlos reasoned, so he looked elsewhere. He moved southward towards a closed door, but paused as he approached it. The floor began to sag under his weight, and he could hear the howling wind and driving rain on the other side of the door. That left only the one door by the stairs for Carlos to try. Shivering from the cold, he reached for the handle and slowly swung open the door with a slow creak. The lone candle stretched out its fragile glow across the now exposed room. A veiled four-posted bed dominated the room, but beyond that he saw the outline of a hearth. For a brief moment, he felt the slightest tinge of optimism warming his heart until the smell hit him. The iron-tinged smell of fresh blood filled this ancient and abandoned abode. Carlos's eyes grew wide and his heart began to race. The movement of shadows caught Carlos's attention. Someone was in here with him. Carlos held his dagger in front of him. "Who goes there? Who are you?" An almost sing-song voice replied mournfully, "I am a prisoner of this tower. Once I was as you are now. The tower claimed me." Carlos couldn't make out the details of the figure, and he took a half-step back. "Enough of your night soil. Speak plainly, or I will fillet you." The voice spoke again. "I can sense a great regret in you." Carlos bit his lip and began to breathe heavily, almost hyperventilating. "Shut up!" "You were close, but you let wealth get between you." "He was planning to do the same," Carlos spat with venom. "I was just faster." "You don't believe that," the voice countered. "You did him a great wrong." "He deserved it. He was always cheating me of my due," Carlos said frantically. "I was the eldest. Me!" "He is coming. He will join us all soon," the voice spoke. "Show yourself. Come into the light," Carlos commanded. At the very edge of the candlelight, Carlos could see a figure swaddled in dusty sheets with ashen gray skin. It held its palms outstretched. They were coated with fresh blood. "I, too, have the blood of kin upon my hands, and so the tower claimed me." Growing faint, Carlos looked upon his hands and saw the blood of his brother that he had wiped off his dagger earlier. Carlos screamed, dropping everything he held, and staggered back into the hall until his back hit the stairs railing. In an unthinking panic, he grabbed his cross and sprinted south into the dark. His foot broke through the floor, tripping him, and sending his great bulk barreling through the door. A more graceful fellow may have been able to catch himself, but Carlos instead flopped belly first onto the layer of wet guano coating the exposed floor and slid forward. He went head first out the missing window. His last sight was of the rapidly approaching pile of rubble below. His neck broke his fall. The figure in the bedchamber dropped the dusty sheets from about himself onto the ground and picked up the candle. He peeked out the door to confirm that Carlos had fallen to his doom. He set the candle on a small table and carefully followed Carlos's path to the hole in the wall. He held his hands in the driving rain until the blood was rinsed off. He then cupped his hands and filled them with water to splash onto his face and smudge off some of the ash and soot that was powdered on it. He walked back to the bedchamber and closed the door behind him. "I can't believe that worked," groaned a pained voice from underneath the bed. "You were lucky he was a bad person." "Not at all," said Jack. "If he was a good person, he wouldn't have harmed us when the ruse failed. We are lucky he wasn't the clever person, though." "How did you know it wasn't the hunchback and monk?" asked the figure under the bed. "I left a note on the wall for them, to wake us when they return with the wagon," Jack said as a matter of factly. "Something we wouldn't need to do if you hadn't gotten yourself impaled searching this worthless ruin for treasure." "Heroes plumb ancient ruins for gold and glory," the voice replied. "I know you were still sore about my hiring of the specialist," Jack said, "but if this tower had anything of value, some goat herder would have taken it 2 days after this place was first abandoned. It's not like people just randomly wander around to ruin buildings and hide treasure in them."